Uh, Tonight I'd like to speak a little bit about a Marian apparition that isn't as well known as I think it deserves to be, and that I think has particular relevance to this time and place. Before getting into the specifics, I want to take a little bit of time to sort of briefly review Marian apparitions. Some things to know. In our theology, Mary plays a lot of roles. She's the new Eve. She's the Ark of the New Covenant. She's the Queen of Heaven. She's our most important saint and our principal intercessor. She's also an evangelist and a recruiter, somebody who's out calling people to a closer and deeper relationship with her Son. Marian apparitions have been around since the beginning. The earliest apparition that we have a record of actually occurred in the middle of the 1st century. It was experienced by the Apostle James the Greater, who of course knew Mary. So this is not a new phenomenon. This is not something that arises in the Middle Ages. This is something that goes back to the beginning of the church. There are a number of early apparitions. An important one would be Our Lady of the Snows in Rome. I don't have time to tell that whole story, but there's the site of the apparition a church was later built, and of course it's been rebuilt and renovated and expanded over the years, but it's still with us, and it's known as St. Mary Major. So if you've ever had an opportunity to visit Rome, that's like ground zero for all things Marian. Another thing to know about Marian apparitions is that they're quite common. They happen actually all the time. Just in my travels around the diocese, speaking to people, I've encountered 3 people who were Protestants, who dropped everything, went and found a priest, and began the process of entering into the Catholic Church after they had an experience of Mary. In all cases, these are what are called private revelations, meaning public revelations have to do with the deposit of the faith, with Scripture, with sacred tradition. The era of public revelation ended with the death of the Apostle John. He was the youngest of Jesus' disciples. He was the only one to die a natural death. He lived into his 80s. He would have been, during the time of Jesus' public ministry, maybe 15 to 18, lived into his 80s. He died around the year 100. That closed out the era of public revelation. So there's the body of Scripture and tradition that we draw upon for all of our doctrines. Those things, that can't be expanded upon. It can be clarified or applied to particular circumstances. But these revelations that occur subsequent to that are what are called private revelations. And most of them are truly private. They're literally just meant for the person who experiences them. But sometimes they include messages that are meant for a broader audience. No Catholic is obliged to believe in any private revelation, which is an important point. So even though these are established part of the faith, and some of them are quite famous, the church never goes as far as saying you have to believe in this. It goes only as far as saying we've investigated and found it worthy of belief. We don't find anything contrary to the faith. We don't find any evidence of fraud. We don't find evidence of mental illness, demonic activity, that kind of thing. The church didn't begin investigating or vetting Marian apparitions until the 16th century, which is why if you search for approved apparitions, the earliest one you will find is Our Lady of Guadalupe in 1531. Of course, there are many, as I mentioned, that are older. The process for investigating Marian apparitions has developed over time. In 1978, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith promulgated a set of rules for how these investigations are to be conducted, and that is still operative today. The Church is very conservative when evaluating Marian apparitions. It distinguishes between an apparition and a vision, an apparition being a genuine experience of something external to the person, and a vision being something that occurs in the person's mind. It distinguishes between objective events and subjective events, in which the person's will or imagination may have played a role. The primary responsibility for investigating Marian apparition rests with the local bishop in whose diocese the event occurred. Typically, the bishop will convene a panel of experts to investigate any alleged apparition. That includes people from a lot of different disciplines because they are looking for things like mental illness, things like demonic activity, fraud. Is someone trying to monetize this event? That kind of thing. The church will often wait a very long time before rendering any kind of a verdict. It could be 200 years. And one of the reasons for that is that one of the things they look for is to see whether this event bears spiritual fruit. Does this become a place of pilgrimage? Is it a place that people are drawn to? Is it a place of conversion? Is it a place of healing? So at the end of the investigation, the bishop can reach one of four conclusions. He can suppress the apparition, meaning there's something about this that's, fraudulent or demonic or doesn't, fit within our theology, and Catholics are not to have anything to do with it. He can reach no verdict, in which case we say we can't determine one way or another. He can authorize pilgrimages and public veneration without going as far as deeming the event worthy of belief. That's the current status, for example, of the Medjugorje apparitions and of all the older apparitions, everything that predates Guadalupe. Or he can find that the event is worthy of belief, meaning he's made a thorough investigation. He hasn't found any evidence of fraud or mental illness or demonic activity, and Catholics who choose to are free to believe that this is a genuine supernatural occurrence. Once an apparition is deemed worthy of belief, the respective bishops' conferences, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, or the Holy See can add their endorsement to the apparition. If they feel that there's something about it that is of universal importance to the Church. As well as I can research this, and I've spent a lot of time now, there are 42 Marian apparitions that have been deemed worthy of belief. Of those, 16 have been endorsed or otherwise promoted by the Holy See or by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And of those, 10 are considered the major apparitions. Those are the ones that most of you will be familiar with. Guadalupe, La Salette, Our Lady of the Golden Heart, Our Lady of Knock. I was in Knock in 2005, but so that was before I had returned to the church. I would get a lot more out of it if I had an opportunity to visit it today. And it's an interesting apparition because it lasted for hours and was seen by more than 20 people who all saw the same thing. Our Lady of Fatima, of course. I haven't seen the movie. I'm never comfortable with Hollywood's handling Catholicism and doing it correctly, but okay, we'll give it a try. Our Lady of Lourdes, the Virgin of the Poor, Banno, Belgium, Our Lady of Happy Meetings, Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal, and Our Lady of Hope. One that has been approved by the local bishop and subsequently endorsed by the Holy See, but has not yet attained that status of major apparition, is the Mother of the World apparitions in Kibeho, Rwanda, which are kind of deserve a mention here. I don't know if you're familiar with any of that, but in 1981, apparitions began in Kibeho, Rwanda, and they had a lot of these sort of, repent, forgive, if you don't, war is going to occur, and it had this feel of sort of, stock into the world kind of stuff. And that was a criticism of it at the time. Gee, Mary is speaking to you, and all she's got to say is this kind of generic, vanilla, apocalyptic kind of stuff. But, of course, Rwanda went on to have the Rwanda genocide in 1994. In about 3 weeks, nearly 1 million people were killed. The worst massacre during that event occurred in Kibeho, not very far from where the apparitions took place. And when you go back and look at what the apparitions said in the early 80s and you compare them to what actually happened in 94, it's uncanny. So it's an interesting apparition and one that has kind of the sort of gaining momentum in terms of pilgrimage and attention. I mentioned Medjugorje. There's another ongoing apparition that you may not be aware of. It's in Argentina. It's called Our Lady of the Rosary. It's occurring in San Nicolas, Argentina. It's been occurring since 1983. There's a woman there named Gladys de Mota. Gladys is very nearsighted. I mean, to the point where even with corrective lenses, it's very hard for her to read. It's very hard for her to write. She has about a 4th grade education. She had an experience of the Blessed Mother in 1983. And Mary said 2 things to her. First, pray the rosary. So it's called Our Lady of the Rosary because one of the core elements of the message has been to try to revive the devotion of regularly praying the rosary. It's one of those things that sort of everybody had and nobody was praying, and that was a core element of what Mary had to say. But the second thing that Mary said in those initial apparitions was to find my statue. And I find this really interesting because Gladys went to see her priest. She explained this occurrence to her priest. The priest said, well, what did she look like? And she describes this inner red garment and outer blue garment and how Mary was standing and so on. And long story short, the bell tower in the cathedral was being used for storage, had been for a long time, right? So it had accumulated all the tangled Christmas tree lights and the board games with the missing pieces and all the kinds of stuff that tends to accumulate in those sorts of spaces. And eventually, the priest and Gladys found among all of this stuff a beautiful statue of the Blessed Mother that looked exactly as Mary had appeared to Gladys and as Gladys had described to the priest. And it turns out that statue had been a gift from the Pope in the 1880s. It had been installed in the cathedral. It had been taken out in the 30s or early 40s when there was a major renovation of the cathedral. It had been put into storage and had been completely forgotten about. Gladys is also interesting because she has the stigmata, and her stigmata is peculiar. There are 2 wounds that appear on her left wrist. That's interesting because the man in the shroud has 2 wounds on his left wrist. It's not consistent with any artistic tradition. And in fact, if you look at the shroud, our faith, of course, doesn't rise or fall on the authenticity of any given relic. But all you can see visually is the blood stain at the left wrist. It's only when you bring in scientific tools like X-ray, ultraviolet analysis, infrared analysis, that kind of stuff, that you can discern that there are 2 wounds in the left wrist that, I don't know whether it's the radius or the ulna, but one of the bones is broken. So it's like the nail was driven in off center, broke the bone, and it was driven in a second time. I don't know why an artist or forger in the medieval period, even if they had some way to do that, why would you do that if it's not visible to the naked eye? I throw that out for consideration. And it just strikes me as very interesting that this person with an elementary school education, who almost certainly would have no way of knowing this detail that is not widely known even today outside of the circle of people who scientifically examine the shroud, that she would know that. So anyway, a little bit about Our Lady of the Rosary in St. Nicholas, Argentina. The apparitions there have been partially approved. They've been approved through a certain date. So I haven't seen that before, but they've been found worthy of belief through a date. And then there's the ongoing apparitions which are still under investigation. All right. So with all that as background, let me introduce you to a woman named Adele Brice. I've heard it pronounced Bryce. I've done a little digging. I think Brice is the correct pronunciation. She was born in Belgium in 1831 to a very devout family. She wanted to enter into religious life from a young age. But in the early 1850s, her family immigrated to the United States, and they settled in Wisconsin, a little north of Green Bay. I'm not sure why that was an area where Belgian immigrants were going at the time, but it was. And this area, the Door Peninsula, if you know Green Bay, or the area on the northern side of the bay, this was old-growth forest at the time. And the principal industry was logging and related kinds of economic activities like sawmills and furniture making and that sort of thing. But it was not a densely populated area. There weren't very many people, and they lived on homesteads that were spread far apart. The men went off to work in the lumber camps. Lumber camps, they'd log in an area for a while, they'd move to a different area, and they'd log in that area for a while. Within a few years, there was a problem. There weren't any schools. There were very few priests. Getting to church was a big ordeal. And so church attendance fell. Catechesis fell. Level of education fell. And people started to fall away from the faith. The children were not being catechized. And so this is kind of the background and the context, the situation that Adele is in when on October 8, 1859, she has her encounter with the Blessed Mother. She was on her way to the grist mill. She had a bag of grain to be ground into flour. And as she was walking on her way, a beautiful woman, appeared to her, clothed in white, gold sash, brilliantly illuminated, standing between a maple and a hemlock. Well, frankly, Adele was just kind of freaked out by this. She didn't say anything. She just continued on her way. She had her grain ground into flour. When she got home, she told her family about it. And frankly, they were rather dismissive. They were kind of the opinion that, well, maybe this is a soul in purgatory that we can pray for or something. But they didn't attach a lot of importance to it. The following day, the 9th, was a Sunday. Adele, her sister, and a neighbor set off for church. On the way to church, the lady appeared again between the maple and the hemlock. Now, the other two women didn't see her, but they observed Adele's reaction. And they were convinced by their experience with Adele that Adele really had seen something, that something had really occurred. And they told her that she needed to tell the priest about this. So the women went to Mass. After Mass, the neighbor and the sister returned home. Adele hung around to talk to the priest. And she explained what had happened over the past 2 days, and the priest said to her, if the woman appears to you again, say to her, in the name of God, tell me who you are. On the way home, the woman appears between the maple and the hemlock, just as she did before, and Adele says to her, in the name of God, tell me who you are. And the woman says, I am the Queen of Heaven, who prays for the conversion of sinners. And Adele goes on to have this conversation with her, what do you want from me? And the woman says, gather together the children of this wild land and teach them the things they need to know for salvation. Teach them to sign themselves with the cross. Teach them the catechism. And Adele is like, how do I do this? Mary says, I will help you. So Adele starts out literally walking a circuit through all these homesteads that would take her on trips that were 40 miles from her home. And she says to each family as she comes to them, let me, for the privilege of teaching your kids this evening, I'll do your chores. She strikes this deal with, I'll wash the clothes, I'll peel the potatoes, if you'll let me sit down with the kids afterwards and teach them to read, teach them the catechism. She does this. And she does this for a number of years before something becomes too much physically. And she goes to the priest and she says, what should I do? And he says, the solution's obvious. You need to bring the children to you. So collection is taken up. The land around the apparition site is purchased. Her father actually builds a log chapel on the site. There's a little school built. There's a cabin built. Adele becomes a third order Franciscan. A couple of other women do as well. And they began operating a school adjacent to this chapel, which marks the site where the apparitions occurred. At some point, they started to keep a few animals, so they actually built a split rail fence around the property. And that becomes important to the story because in 1871, there was a severe drought. And in the lumber camps, they generate a certain amount of waste. They take all the branches off the trees, they generate a lot of sawdust, and it was their practice to gather all this up into a waste pile and burn it. Well, there's a severe drought in 1871, October 8, 1871, 12 years to the day that Marian first appeared to Adele. One of those waste fires gets out of control. The trees begin to catch. And in fact, there's a cold front moving through that brings in a strong wind, and it touches off a firestorm where one tree catches, the next tree catches, the next tree catches. The fire moved through the forest, they estimate, at 110 miles per hour. Obviously, there were people who tried to outrun it. People crawled into streams or down into wells or waded out into the bay. But not everybody reacted that way. A certain number of people went the other direction. They went into the fire. They went to the chapel site where they found Adele and her sisters inside praying. They all crowded into this little log chapel, and Adele led them through the night with prayer and the singing of hymns, and occasionally with procession. She would take the statue of Mary. She would lead the group in procession around the interior of the chapel. And then, the heat must have been unbearable. But after midnight, it began to rain, and it rained hard. And by the morning, the rain, by sunrise, the rain had put out the fire. When the people in the chapel came out, they found that the split rail fence that surrounded the property was charred on the outside all the way around on all edges of the property, but not burned on the inside. One of the survivors described it as the property as an emerald isle in a sea of ash. The fire is known as the Peshtigo fire. 1.2 million acres burned in a night. We think 2,000 or so people killed. Worst wildfire in recorded history. But not at the chapel. Everybody at the chapel was fine. So Adele continued on in her role as a Franciscan sister and teacher until her death in 1896. Eventually, a brick church was built to replace the log chapel, and that brick church stood until 1941, when the church that is there now was constructed. And in fact, when they were building the new church, and they excavated under the main altar, they found two enormous tree roots, one from a maple and one from a hemlock. They're on display in a glass case at the shrine today. In 2009, this has been a place of pilgrimage actually for a long time. The church has never taken any action to suppress that. But in 2009, David Ricken, the Bishop of Green Bay, began a formal investigation. And in 2010, he pronounced it worthy of belief. And in 2016, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops designated the church there as a national shrine, giving it their endorsement. So this is America's Lourdes. It's America's Fatima. I checked. It's like a $100 round trip or $150 round trip ticket. Direct flights from Pittsburgh, hour and 44-minute flight, 20 minutes north of the airport is the shrine. It's in a little unincorporated area called Champion, Wisconsin. So what I said at the beginning, that I thought this apparition deserves to be better known. And I also think that it has a relevant message for our time. Well, of course, the relevant message is catechesis. I mean, we've all seen the abysmal statistics, and I don't need to run through all that, but something like 4% of Catholics are really engaged with their faith. The majority of Mass-attending Catholics don't believe in the real presence. We have all kinds of... one of the things I've learned in traveling around and speaking and writing is that the better people understand the Catholic faith, not only what it teaches, but where those teachings come from, and how they're rooted in Scripture, and how they're rooted in sacred tradition, the more amenable, the more favorable their view of the Catholic Church and of the Catholic faith. It's, in my speaking, it's the Protestants, who come to a lot of my presentations, or who invite me to speak, or who follow up with me afterwards regarding questions. So this is really something I don't want to. I'll bring my ideas to the September 19 retreat, but I feel like this is the 1, 2, and 3 on our agenda. It needs to be catechizing Catholics. It needs to be teaching the faith. It needs to be addressing people's questions and concerns. And so, since that's kind of the message of Our Lady of Good Help, which is the name of this apparition, I want to leave you with Our Lady's words: gather the children and teach them the things they need to know for salvation. Worthy Grand Night, worthy Deputy Grand Night.